In this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about calculations, deal calculations, and how to do them. And with that in mind, let's go and have a look at this. So, if you remember, I talked about this in a previous lecture. I built a deal calculator tool. Now, the way you'll be able to get access to this is to use the link below in the resources section and then make a copy for yourself. It's on Google Sheets, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's Google Sheets instead of Excel. They're good reasons. It's all to do with some of the functionality in Google Sheets and the way some of the formulas work. But the upshot is it's very helpful, and I use this constantly. And the backstory to this was that I was doing lots of calculations kind of ad hoc, and they weren't good enough. And I wanted to, as much as anything for myself, I wanted to really interrogate every single scenario based on a set of core variables and then have them all in one document and then give them to a client or use them for myself. And then I would understand where I kind of stood with any given deal at hand. So let's just quickly do an example one. So this is the one in St. Mary's Road. And let's say that the rent is going to be 725 and it's £160,000 and it's in M28. So let's just run the numbers in here. And one of the things is that I have various scenarios. So I did a deep dive into taxation. I'm not a tax expert. These may be wrong, but so far so good. And with that, I'm able to calculate actual post-tax net return, which is incredibly helpful. And then I have references so you can dig into all of that data. So we said M28, I think it was. So M28, there it is. And the reason that's important is because I have some PropertyData data in the back end where I do some calculations. Now, what's my target yield? I want it to be at least above 5.2. Why? Because based on mortgage pressure tests and so on, you really have to get a yield of 5.2 or above on a property to make it work. Now, what's the expected monthly rent? We said I'm going to go 750. I'm going to go, so 750, I think it was. Let's just go back to the listing here. Now, for our own system, I built our own algorithm, which rental and assessment algorithm, which is quite complex, but it works really well and it's quite granular. And we use that for outline yield assessment. But for the purposes of this, so that says 695, and then we've got these guys and they're saying 659. All right, I'm just going to go for 700 on my calculations. And 700. Okay, so that gives us some information so far. Now we need to put in the price, and they're asking for 160,000. So let's just put that number in. And this gives us a gross rental yield of 5.03. So immediately that's not so good. You should be able to. No, it's very close to the wire. So, okay, fine. I think the yield is a little low for me on this one based on these calculations. But anyway, let's carry on. And let's assume 75% LTV, therefore 120 grand mortgage. And then we have stamp duty based on my profile. Then I've got all the other background costs. If you're not using us, this isn't relevant. If you are, then there's a sourcing fee. And the reason we're worth it, I suppose, is because we handle the negotiations and we work really well for foreign nationals who just can't do all of this stuff. And so we save people time, we handle the negotiations, and we also see properties to completion. So that's why we're worth it. If we're worth it to you, talk to me. If we're not, DIY. And this is why I do this course, so that you can help yourself. Okay, and let's assume we're going to renovate this property. It needs very little renovation, so I'm going to say £4,000. So this £160,000 property total cash down 55,000 pounds for rounded numbers. And then we have mortgage interest. Let's say it's through a limited company and you're a UK resident, then probably about 3.2%. And that gives you total annual costs, if you assume all of these numbers, of 5,839. Let's assume you did the right thing, bought a property in a nice area, which this one is, then you'll have minimal voids. So on average, you might have 2 weeks where the property is empty per year. And therefore your total profits are 1,791. So how useful is this, right? So you've got all this information, you know all the breakdowns, and you can change all the variables on your copy of the spreadsheet to suit you and to suit the numbers that you think are going to work. So your cash return on your cash ROI is 3.7, but this is based on just income only. Now, the next question is, you've got your longer term 5-year ownership numbers, and if you adjust for inflation, that's where rent goes up, your mortgage stays the same, interest rates stay roughly in line as they have been, and therefore your ROI is 4%. Not especially good, but that doesn't factor in capital growth. Now, because you're buying somewhere where growth is higher than the rest of the Northwest, or just a little bit higher, but it's solid, it's not a bad area, it's just not amazing, then let's say you've done the renovations and it's worth £165,000. So what's your outlook? Well, if you don't adjust, then in 5 years, in theory, it'll be worth this. Now, I'm okay looking 5 years in advance because I think the market will top out in about 4 or 5 years. So that's a reasonable timeline. We could look 10 years in advance, but let's just stick with 5 for now. And we can see that the total average return on capital growth, in other words, the growth per year, is nearly just over £9,000. And that makes the return on investment just on capital growth somewhere around 6%. That's awesome. But what about if we combine the rent income and the capital growth? Well, in real terms, real wealth gain, I've got a 10% return on investment. If I do it nominally without adjusting for inflation, that's 20% per year, which is really quite good, in fact. So the numbers are quite attractive. And as I constantly say, if you buy in the right spot where the growth is decent, you're in a good place. So let's say hypothetically you wanted to buy it and do it up and sell it. Well, because of all the extra costs of acquisition, you would lose money if you just sold it tomorrow, hypothetically. If you wanted to refinance in 5 years, then yes, that could be possible. So let's say you're reaching the top of the market and you think, okay, I don't think it's going to crash that far and I want to get some cash out before everything dives. So, I'm going to do this because I know that in a recession, prices may go down, but rents not necessarily. So why do I say that? Because oftentimes it's not just the economy that dives, it's the access to money that crashes, and therefore people just can't get mortgages, but they need to live somewhere, and thus rents often hold up in down cycles. Now that's an analogous view, but because I don't have data on that actually, which is annoying, but there you go. But that's what I would imagine. Anyway, the point is you could take 38 grand out of that. How cool is this? So this is based on a simple algorithm which just says whatever the last 5 years growth was, extrapolate it to the future, then give me numbers, inflation adjusted, and so on. In theory, you could take that 38 grand and invest and use it as a deposit for another property. And actually, a lot of banks quite like that as a process. So you could, in theory, just keep buying more property over time and use the net cash return, i.e. the money that you get on a monthly basis, as it were, as your income. And then finally, if you wanted to sell the whole thing out and just like I'm done, then you could walk away with 78 grand. So this would be the total amount that you'd clear if you were selling in that time. Anyway, the main point about all of this is that you got the calculations. You're able to make some sense of a property deal right down into the little details. And I think that's a really useful tool, and I hope you find it helpful too.